Hi everyone, Linda here. I cannot believe we are at the end of week 3 already. We've learned so much this week as we explored the ICD-10 codebook with a focus on chapters 1 through 3 covering infectious disease, neoplasms, and diseases of the blood-forming organs. There seems to be a common theme, though, in the discussion this week, which is that there's some difficulty in knowing when to use multiple codes to capture a condition, and generally determining which guideline to apply in coding. So honestly, there's really no quick answer that I can give that will apply to every scenario, but what I can say is that coding is a practice, much like that of a physician or a nurse. Well, with the exception of the clinical care. But they learn the basics in school, and then they move on to the workforce where they begin their career with a mentor and they practice. And the same is true for coders. And in time, with a lot of practice, you're going to improve. But understanding that coding is a career of lifelong learning, and you've been at it for about 3 weeks. So when you compare 3 weeks to the length of an entire career, you must admit it's just not a very long period of time. So to that, I will say you are all doing a really spectacular job. You're exactly where you should be at this stage of your learning, so don't get frustrated. You are attempting to learn and absorb an enormous amount of material, and it'll take some time and some practice. So, okay, I'm going to go ahead and attempt to make navigating the codebook a little easier for you by pointing out how the codebook offers clues and sometimes some pretty obvious direction on how you should code something. So first off, we have the coding conventions here in the front of your code book. I'm sure we're all very familiar with all of this and looking up the individual sections. But we can, as you scroll through, you see that we have the different alphabetic index and the tabular index, and the recommendation that you always go to the alpha index first and then go into the tabular list to check your codes, and that's a very important direction. Many times you cannot find the correct code if you don't take that order. And then as we scroll through the conventions further, we have some direction on the abbreviations, and you'll notice that for some of these things, they're not the same in the alpha index as they are in the tabular index. So you want to be careful of that. You want to make sure that all things mean the same in each section of the codebook, and you want to take note of when they do not. So for instance, brackets. It's another example of what I mean. Brackets are used differently in the alpha index than they are in the tabular index. So if you see a bracket in the alpha index, it means that it is telling you there is a manifestation code that must be added to the code you are looking to apply to your account. So there would be 2 codes in that case. And when you see brackets in the tabular list, it's enclosing explanatory phrases. So you see 2 very, very different definitions and an important distinction to make. So for here, I would just say the important takeaway about your convention is to know what's here so that you can refer to it quickly later. Don't be afraid to make notes and put post-it tabs in there. Write notes in your code book. These are allowed even when you take your CCS exam. So you can take your test with notes and flags in your book as long as the notes are written in the book. You can't have loose sheets or loose papers. Another important aspect of the guidelines are the chapter guidelines, and I'm going to skip down here to chapter 2 on neoplasms. And the great information here is, how do we code some of these things? So there's distinctions made in this section on how to code complications associated with a malignancy. How do we code various complications due to chemotherapy or radiation associated with a malignancy? How do we code anemia associated with malignancy, which happens to be different than all the other types of complications we could have for a neoplasm? So pay close attention to the various directions that you're going to find in these sections. So we will come on over to the code book actually and take a look at colitis. So we're right here in our index and we're going to start taking a look at the effect of some of those conventions, right? We have a lot of parenthetical phrases here. And what this is telling us is that for the term colitis, if the physician is stating chronic colitis or non-infective, hemorrhagic, that we are to use this code K529. And if the physician doesn't state these terms, you can still use K529 depending on what your diagnostic statement is. If you see something more specific in this category that matches your diagnostic statement, then obviously you use that. But the important takeaway here is that these parenthetical terms are clarifying everything that is included in just plain old colitis. And sometimes that can be confusing. We look in the code book, okay, great, but it's colitis, but what does that include? These parenthetical terms attempt to clear that up for us. So also we see here a see also note where it says check out enteritis. So we'll see if we can do that right now. So enteritis. We again see some parenthetical phrases and we'll see that many of them are the same as what were listed next to colitis. And we see that the terms are taking us to the same code. So basically the index is indicating to us that colitis and enteritis are the same thing. Again, you want to make sure that your diagnostic statement doesn't include something more specific like Clostridium difficile enteritis or amoebic enteritis, regional enteritis. These are all more specific terms, but generally speaking, you get the idea of what's going on with these parentheses. So now let's just say that I have an account for a patient that is diagnosed with anemia due to a fish tapeworm infection. Okay, so I would go to my code index, my alpha index, excuse me, to look up anemia, because that's what they have, right? They have anemia due to a fish tapeworm infection. And I look through the classification, and lo and behold, I find a fish tapeworm infestation. So is that the same as infection or not? I really don't know. And what it's telling me is that I have the B700 code, and in brackets, I have a D code. And because I'm in the alpha index, I know that if something is in brackets, I need to code it with the preceding code. So these two need to go together, but I'm just not sure if they really meet the definition of my diagnosis. So, well, again, the index is giving me some clues. I have a B code, and I know that's from the infectious and parasitic disease section, so that seems right. And then I have a D code from the blood-forming disease section. So, or blood-forming organ section, I'm sorry. But still, I have anemia due to a fish tapeworm infection. It seems like this might be right, but I'm not really sure. So the next thing I would do is then go to my tabular index and look these things up. So here I am at B700, and I've got this big old condition that I cannot pronounce. But for the descriptions of this condition, the B700 lists fish tapeworm infection in parentheses. So this now is, as far as I know, because of the parentheses, a non-essential modifier. So the fact that my physician is calling it a fish tapeworm infection in his diagnosis does not make a difference. I know I'm in the right section because it says infection here, and because of the coding rule, my doctor didn't even have to say that word. He could just say, anemia due to fish tapeworm. The other issue I have is that there's nothing mentioned here about anemia at all. So what do? I mean, I need to capture anemia because it's specifically stated in my diagnosis, but it's nowhere to be found here. So this, I believe, is probably what that second code is all about. So let me look that up. and I have D638, and it turns out that code is anemia and other chronic diseases classified elsewhere. So that's making me feel a whole lot better about what I read in the alpha index, because it's starting to make a whole lot of sense. And even the description goes further to say, code first your underlying disease, such as, this looks familiar, the B700. So there's my tapeworm infection. So I put the tapeworm infection first. I list it first as my principal diagnosis because the code set tells me to, and anemia will come second. And now I know that I have captured the entire diagnostic statement that the physician gave me for my patient. So I'm feeling really confident in my coding. I found everything that I needed to find to complete this account, and I'm feeling pretty great about it now. So this example also illustrates the order that is required to find our correct codes. You must go to the alpha index first, or you would never have found the correct combination in this case, because if you just went to fish tapeworm in chapter 1 for B700, we never would have found the anemia code. And I'm not even sure I would have recognized that the fish tapeworm is considered a chronic disease classified elsewhere. So I might have ended up with an anemia code, but likely I would have chosen the incorrect one. So by going through the steps for proper coding, I found the correct codes. I can be confident, and if someone challenged me, I can use the notation in the code book to support my actions and my code selections, which is very important. We can't stress that enough. And we had an example of how the bracketed code in the alpha index are manifestation codes used together with the preceding code in the index. So for me, if a code title doesn't capture everything that I can say about the patient's condition, I do double check the code index, the tabular list, so on, follow these steps. I look for any notations, any code also notes, excludes notes, includes notes, anything that can give me some direction. I thoroughly check my see also notes, because you would be surprised what you can turn up following that. And I know that doing these things makes you feel like you're on a wild goose chase. I think that exact phrase was used this week. And I can see how that's true. And in time, with practice, you will definitely improve, and the process will become shorter for you as you learn more and more about the code index and the code sets in general. You'll be able to do all of this a lot faster. And you will be able to continue doing the proper steps too. You won't really have to take any significant shortcuts. It will get better. So anyway, I think that covers the majority of what we focused on this week. I know it's a lot, but in time you will get it. And as always, please reach out with any questions or concerns that you have. I'm happy to help. And have a great weekend, everybody.